Well, hello.
Good morning. Whoops,
Hello.
my video is not. There we go. There we go. You guys don't need to be this loud. Here, let me fix that.
Oh,
How was your trip?
it was good. Had a good time. It's interesting to see went to the Florida Keys.
Yeah, have you been there
Down there.
before?
No, so it was interesting to see.
Yeah,
Um, I don't have any need to go back.
that's kind of the way I feel about all those cactuses in Tucson.
Uh, nice to see once, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think, and I what I did also didn't realize the geography. Well, yeah, the geography. It's mangroves
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
most of it. And for someone who likes to snorkel, that's frustrating.
Oh, yeah, there's no open water.
Yeah, you got to go offshore mostly.
Right, right. I lived in Georgia for a while and I was in some program where I did a research thing on the mangroves.
Oh
I never
wow.
I never went to see them, but I know a lot about them, or I did. I no longer do. Don't ask me a bunch of questions. But you found places to snorkel?
We did find one,
Yeah.
a little beach, and it had some rocks, sort of around the middle of the Keys. But I did, and I found a spiny lobster, which I snuck up on and then grabbed real quick and discovered it was dead.
Oh no. It was underwater.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
sitting. So, well, oh, that's kind of cool. I've never seen one of these.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, it was. I always felt very proud of myself being very stealthy.
Exactly right. You would have been fine back in the hunter-gatherer days.
Yeah, if it died before I got there, I can catch it.
I know, right? Now, you did not send out a reminder this
I
time.
for Oh geez, I was going to do that this morning and then I forgot. So I
Well,
forgot.
I found an old one, and so
And
any.
it's yeah, it's the same link.
I
So
know, right, right, right. I should just save it somewhere.
Yeah, I added to my calendar.
Oh, good idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then I just bring it up and click.
Yeah.
hmm.
We're so techie,
Oh yeah.
There's a
us
place
old people.
for URL in the appointments.
Ah,
Ah, wow.
sophisticated.
Hi, Nance.
Hello, Nina.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent. No polyps.
Oh,
That's good.
congratulations.
A little too much information.
well, well, let's see. Just 1 minute. Maybe we give everybody a minute or two.
So, Richard, all, well, all of us really, including the philosophers, um, often are reacting to ideas that came before, right?
Sure.
So, um, yeah, I
Yeah,
guess it's an obvious statement, but as I was reading, I'm like, but they came up with these thoughts because of what was existing. So it's sort of in a reaction to the
Well,
idea
and the
of the
culture is
time.
additive, so that's so it's all built on something else that came before it.
So if we
Yeah.
didn't have Christianity, our philosophy might be looking very differently.
In some ways, probably. Yeah. I mean, some of it could sort of be the natural evolution of thinking as it gets, because a lot of, I mean, like religion I've talked about goes from magic to something more complicated and sophisticated. And I think a lot of philosophy kind of is following that along. So it might be, it'd be, yeah. I mean, some of those things would be the same.
But I mean, a lot of the philosophers, at least in the Western world, are, is there a God? Isn't there a God? Should, you know, anyways, yeah, the God thing really is predominant.
Yeah, they just been about it. Yeah, in the Middle Ages, especially. Although, the Alfred North Whitehead, the physicist and mathematician guy, he had a line in one of his books once where he said that there is nothing new in philosophy. It's all just footnotes to Plato.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Janet, do you have a hand up?
I did, thanks. So before we, I know everybody's not here yet, but before we move into the existential issues, could you sum up briefly the emotional ones again? Because I'm very confused by what you're saying about that.
Well, I threw some a lot of details at you, but yeah, I think the big idea is that that we've historically liked to think of human beings as rational, which is kind of where the name comes from, Homo sapiens, wise man. But what we know from the neuroscience is that all of our thinking goes through emotional centers, and so all of our experiences are emotionally tinged one way or another. And that introduces fragility in the system. So it means that we could be overwhelmed by something that surprises us or threatens us or even is just very interesting to us. So given that the intelligence that we also have and that fragility means that we need systems in place that will give us somewhere to go when those things happen. And so religion's is providing the framework. The term that's going to matter, kind of come up over and over again, especially in this coming chapter, is going to be worldview. So religion is providing this worldview that tells you ahead of time what kinds of how to interpret different kinds of things. So we are prone to respond to noises that we can't identify, and we're prone to assume this will come up today. We're prone to assume that things are caused by agents. And so if you have a worldview that tells you that scratchy noises in the dark are ghosts, anytime you encounter that kind of experience, you're going to rush to categorize that as ghost. But if the worldview is sort of solid and that it's something else, then you'll go something else, but your emotions are going to be all stirred up from the experience regardless.
Okay, so it's not so much that we have an emotional need as everything is emotionally shaped in some way, and so your thesis is this gives us a framework to deal with that. So we're not born needy, we're experientially emotional.
Yes.
Okay, and so we need this to help us
Navigate,
deal with those emotions or frame them and
mm-hmm.
or know what to do with them rather than say pray, pray, pray and run away. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
That's just fascinating to me. I mean, it's just blowing my mind.
Well, I'm trying to think of like the elevator pitch. So when I say to people, oh, I'm taking this philosophy class about what is religion, and there's these three things, and then people look at me, and then I can't even make it past the emotion part, which is only the first. So, okay, so that makes it simple. We're emotionally shaped by everything is emotional.
Yeah, because we're emotional.
Another question before we get started too is consciousness and self-awareness interchangeable?
Well, generally, when philosophers are talking about this kind of thing, they're most interested in what we would call self-consciousness, which to a psychologist might mean that you're, hyper aware and neurotic. But in a philosophical language, what it means is that you're aware of yourself as a conscious being around other conscious beings. So, and that's an important issue because we kind of want to know what it is, where does that come from, how does the brain do it, and also what other creatures can do it, and so there's some clever tests that psychologists have for this kind of a thing, that they use a mirror and a spot of paint on the subject's forehead, and it turns out when a baby's about 6 months old, if you put it in front of a mirror and you put a spot of paint on its forehead, the baby will reach for its own forehead. Prior to that, it's more likely to reach for the image, and which a lot of monkeys will do. But some of the apes, so they're chimps and gorillas, I think, who have both passed this test, where you put the spot of paint, put it in front of a mirror, and they reach for their own forehead. So they clearly are recognizing that that's me in the mirror. But they have to, humans are doing it at 6 months. I think chimps and bonobos are doing it like in full adulthood. So it's taking a lot more development in their brain to get to that point. And there's a test that someone did, and I've lost track of the details, but they did it with a dolphin. And you had the same thing, you have to use a mirror, but you're doing something to get the dolphin to recognize that it's in the mirror and it's not just a different dolphin. The way if you watch cats and dogs, if they recognize anything in the mirror at all, they'll think it's just a different animal. So it's kind of curious to see, how many other creatures can we find that have this capacity. And there's some people, I think, arguing that crows and ravens are self-conscious that way, because they are especially bright little creatures. And that's a little more mysterious because their evolution is so different from ours. When we find other mammals that have those kinds of features, it's all sort of related, at least in our evolution. But a bird's brain is so radically different from ours, and yet to see that it seems to be able to do this, it's those small examples of birds. Okay. Well, anyway, let's get going. So the issue today is about definition, and it's just existential is sort of the language that philosophy uses to talk about definition, individual definition. So that worldview I was mentioning, actually, I guess it's worth summarizing. There's some anthropologists who would have a very basic definition of religion, that religion is a worldview with a ritual system. That's it. So if you have this worldview and you have some rituals that are reinforcing it, that's religion. So and that's pretty good as a basic definition. It does pick out the things it needs to pick out. So the worldview is important in all three. It's playing a role in all three of these categories that I'm laying out. The emotional piece is you're getting the worldview to tell you how to manage those. The existential piece, the worldview is telling you what is a human being, what are human beings do, and may get pretty fine-tuned into what you particular, where you are in your culture, what's expected of you. So that existential definition can be pretty specific depending on the culture. But the point is it's a part of it seems to be a part of all of the religions in the world. So the argument again is that would seem to be something that human brains need, is that we need to know who we are, and then in how people are supposed to relate to each other, and then that'll go into the social piece, the last piece, which is going to have a heavy dose of stuff like ethics in it. How is it society is supposed to work? So emotional life, individual definition, social life. Those are sort of the three big things. And let's see. So same thing here. I have a couple of interesting people, talking about, in this case, it's more about anthropology, with a little bit of neuroscience thrown in. So a couple of people to introduce you to who came up in the book with some interesting insights. So I think what I'll just do is start with Pascal Boyer. It's spelled Boyer, but he's French, so it's pronounced Boyer. Let me wait. I got to do a share thing here. Do that. Okay, that's him. So I have a short video where he's talking about sort of aesthetics, which is kind of interesting and relates a little bit last week, and then a little bit longer piece that's more kind of specifically on this existential stuff, or relates to it anyway. All right.
What do you make of aesthetic cognitivism?
So the idea of aesthetic cognitivism, which is a bit of a mouthful, is to explore the very special kinds of mental effects aesthetic experience can bring about. That at least is the take I have on this. And the idea is that aesthetic experience typically does not give you, obviously, different beliefs or information. You cannot look at a sculpture and sort of verbally express exactly what you have now that you didn't have before. So lots of people have been saying, well, if he doesn't do that, he does nothing. There's pleasure, and that's it. Lots of people are saying, no, it must do more, and there must be some more sort of lasting, important effects on the mind. The thing is that since they're not verbal, they're very difficult to report, and therefore we should explore them in other ways. Now, some people think, well, we should look at what artists have to say about that. It seems to me that that may not be the most profitable way for lots of reasons. One of them is that the fact that you produce something doesn't mean that you have very good intuition on its effects on people. A second one is that artists are not always the most articulate people about their own art. And we shouldn't sort of expect much enlightenment from that. However, what we can do is lots of other things. We can do psychology of these things. We can see how human minds react to these things. We can also see to what extent perspectives on things can change. Do people recognize patterns in the world that they didn't before they saw some art? And then we have the sort of further development, which is if you're considering specifically people's spiritual, religious notions, can you say that exploring them through art makes a difference? That is, are they different from what they would have been, for example, from purely verbal exposure to doctrine? Do you get something different?
And if the answer to that is yes, it does not follow that that validates that religion. It just could say that that emotional impact reinforces some underlying need for religion because of the emotion.
No, of course. I mean, it's completely orthogonal to the question, is that effect, does that effect get you closer to truth?
Yeah.
It may,
Yes,
it may get you much further away from truth. Who knows? I mean, that's not the problem.
Well, some people think it is. Some people think that the artistic experience can bring you closer to truth, and that truth has a theological component.
Yeah. So this is one of the little sort of side thing I want you to notice along the way is that our own intuitions about what we're doing are not necessarily reliable. So remember, that's why I started with Dennett, talking about you don't know your own consciousness. So what's going on is curious, and the way that what I've really come to via Dennett, the way I think about it is we by and large, what goes on in our brain is a rationalization of what we just did. So now we're relying on intuitions that are coming from aesthetic experiences, going through various circuits in the brain that are tied to our emotions and different memories, and then claiming that you learned something from that. It's a really kind of suspicious claim, depending on what you're talking about. But it's anyway, just this really important piece that we're not the best, most reliable sources of information, even about ourselves, because there's all this other stuff going on behind the screens.
Some people think that,
I think so, yes.
but that's.
They may very well think
you're not in
that.
that
I
category.
do not wish to comment.
Okay, if you would look 10 years in the future and see and look back at the aesthetic cognitivism program and call it a success, what would it will have had to have done?
It would show to what extent aesthetics goes beyond the aesthetic, to what extent we can shape minds. We can have our minds shaped by particular works and encounter with those works and the process of trying to encounter those works. That would be very rich. It seems to me that as far as spiritual, religious concerns go, all we can say all we can say even in 10 years is that it has some association with it. It facilitates certain things, but I don't think we'll find any specific meaning aspects of religious belief that would be uniquely encountered through art.
Meet the new
No, nuts ad.
Sleep Number Climate 360 smart bed that actively cools, warms, and responds to you. Shop now at sleepnumber.com.
No.
Well, Chris, how does
It
aesthetic
was
cognitivism give
short
us
one. Hold
a
on.
fresh view?
Okay, so it's he'll get to in this other thing. I think we'll get to some of this a little bit more directly, but what I'm getting at with via his ideas is that just as with the emotional piece, you need the framework to know what to do with it. Do you also need that framework to know who you are? And that's going to do a lot to tell you about how to manage the experiences you're having as they come in. Is if you already have this framework that says this is who I am and this is what I do, then you can plug that in. But absent that kind of definition, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself in the face of in the face of new information or new experiences. And interestingly enough, a lot of it is happening below the level of conscious awareness at the same time. So we think we're reasoning our way to it, but we're really having an emotional reaction, and then we're going to rationalize the reaction that we just had with a story to tell about how that makes sense. So I think this one, I'm not going to show the whole thing, but this will get at a little bit more detail on it here. It's about 10 years old, an interview he did at the University of Oregon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming to speak with us. I'm going to start with a really big question, and you can tell me if you want to change that and make it a smaller one instead. But the first question I had for you is, why is there some kind of religion in all human cultures?
All right, change the question, please.
All right, let's change it.
Let's try that one. That one is the answer to that one would be would take a very long time and probably would take a whole career to solve. So it's true that there is some kind of religion in all human societies that we've documented. And it's also true that it goes as far back as we can document, in the sense that even Neanderthals, for example, seem to have done things that we would think are religious, like burying your dead with, decoration and things like that, in what seems to be a ritualized way. So we have that. And why do we have that everywhere? The first thing to notice that we don't have it in very much the same way everywhere. And that lots of things that we think are religion and have to be in religion are actually not that frequent around the world. One thing that I always try to tell people, to start with, because it's very important, is that concern for the afterlife, the sanction for one's good or bad deeds in one's life, the origin of the world, the question whether there's a creator in the world. All these are questions that are actually not present in that many human cultures. So we have religion in the sense of having something we can talk about a bit more in a minute that looks like religious, but it's very different from what we are used to in the West. It can be very different, and it's often not in the form of a doctrine or a very explicit set of ideas. It's more in a set of presuppositions that people have about the way the world is, what's around.
Worldview.
So first of all, the question I asked you was to ask you to summarize your entire life's work, which was an
Yes,
unfair
that's
place to
right.
start. But beyond that, it
Mhm.
might lead us to the next question, which is how we define what we mean by religion.
That's right, and it's pretty difficult to do that because most of the definitions we have are based on what we're familiar with. What we're familiar with is, in general, world religions, literate religions, where there are scriptures, priests, an establishment, if you want. When where there is a notion of commitment, of being a member of a religion. Now, it's pretty clear that what we had for millennia was more of a tribal kind of set of religious ideas and behaviors, where there is no doctrine that is very explicit. There are no priests, there are no institutions. No one would think that you have to be a member of the local religion. There are ghosts, ancestors, spirits, gods, whatever, but they're there. It would make no sense to say that you're a member of a religion. You would just deal with the stuff that's there, and that stuff includes ghosts, gods, all sorts of things like that. So, how do we define it? Well, we define it by people's belief and commitment to the idea that there are non-physical human agents around them. That's a lot of jargon to say that basically the idea of a spirit or a god is what is the signal of religion. But it's very important to think that to realize that this very often means a whole variety of agents that are around, that people think are around, that are not physically present or very easy to detect, but are very important in people's lives because they bring about misfortune, but also good fortune. And they can be a source of help, but also of danger. So that's what we have. That's what we find in lots of different places.
If I understood you correctly.
And we call that basic system animism. So the basic assumption is that everything has a kind of spirit or some agency to it. And history of religion is going from the world is full of many spirits to it has fewer and fewer of them. So as religion evolves, and then you sort of end up with monotheism where there's only one spirit.
Correctly, one of the precepts that we need to give up on in order to understand this is a sort of religion where one chooses one's denomination or chooses to ally with it or not. You're talking about structures that exist in the kind of world understanding of people in different cultures.
That's right. And there's no sense of choosing the worldview in that sense because, you don't really choose to be a believer in the existence of chairs, buses, tables, and things like that. Where in the same way, lots of people in most tribal societies would tell you, well, there are spirits around. It's not a choice of believing in them. You just have to deal with them, to interact with them.
Could you give an example or two?
Yes, well, I can give you examples of that from places where I did field work, where I studied the local religious system, and particularly in Cameroon, where I did lots of studies of people's religious ideas. And over there, I would say that the most important agents that are interacting with people are their ancestors, which means dead people, but dead people who are sort of become anonymous, a sort of mass of, our forebears. It's a bit like the founding fathers here, it's like, we can invoke them, we can have connection with them. They wanted us to do this and that, and they're conveniently dead, so they can't, answer back to what people say. And a whole variety of sort of bad, evil spirits that are sort of, roam around and annoy people in all sorts of ways. Now, these entities are not terribly important in people's lives in the sense of what we'd call religious commitment. No one thinks about them in terms of commitment. But when people are sick, when the crops are not doing quite as well as they expected, when anything turns out bad, or if things turn out too well for some people, then people start to think, well, there's some sort of agency there. The spirits must be in on this one, or the ancestors are punishing this person for not doing something, for not giving them sacrifices or things like that. So that's the way it interacts in people, but in people's lives. But one thing that you will never encounter in places of that kind is people telling you that this is what explains the origin of evil, or the origin of the world, or why the world is the way it is, or things like that. And I think those concerns are concerns that you have once you have a sort of priesthood whose job it is to, as it were, create those questions and then give the answers. Absent that kind of institution, people are not terribly interested in those questions.
So it's important that what he means when he says why, that it just is. So the animism doesn't have the sophistication in it to ask, well, why is the world this way? It's just saying the world is this way. And here I guess it's worth reinforcing that you may not think about this immediately as an existential point, but this is actually sort of deeply existential, because when someone in that kind of worldview is, what they're understanding is that human beings exist in this relationship that has a connection to past generations, those that are the primary spirits they're concerned with, but also then has a relationship with all of these other things in nature. And so, there's a spirit to the river, there's a spirit to the different animals, a spirit to the weather. And as a human, that worldview has defined you as vulnerable to all of them. Therefore, you're obliged to be respectful to them in some manner. And gratitude is a very common reaction that people have. So you sacrifices to sort of share a little bit. The common one in Africa is spilling it on the ground. You spill a little of whatever you had on the ground, and the ancient Hebrews, right, would burn it so the smoke is going up to God, and so that's how you're sharing with the divine. So gratitude plays a big role in all of those relationships, but it's very existential in that it's defining what human beings are and how they work in this system of spirits. That make sense? All righty. I'm going to skip a little here. If I can figure out how to do that. 16. Whoop. There we go.
Psychology, anthropology, theology, all those things together. But I'm curious if you could step back for a moment and go back to try to explain what it is in the human makeup that leads us to have some kind of belief that one might call religious.
There is one problem about that question, which is that it assumes that there's one answer. That is, there is one thing that may make us have those ideas. So Freud used to think that certainly, our early relationship to our fathers would be the source of religious notions. Or other people might think that it's class relations or things like that. What seems to emerge from the kind of research that we do on these things is that it's not quite like that. it's more like a market phenomenon. When a company is successful, it's not because it treats its employees well. It's not because it treats its customers well. It's not because it does it makes good quality stuff. It's because it does all those things. So the reason why religious ideas are widespread is not that they titillate or satisfy one little system in the mind. It's rather that they do it to all sorts of different systems. And therefore, there is no sort of single reason why these things are successful where we have them. There's rather a sort of multiplicity of mental systems that seem to find those ideas at least worth entertaining, talking about, communicating to others. And, you know, so there is a sort of catalog of things that are important for religion. One of them is just this notion of having more agents in the world than there seems. So we create fiction. We get moved by fiction. We fall in love with fictional heroes and heroines and people like that. We're used to thinking about dead people as if they were around to, you know, to judge us. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for a human being to say that I'm ashamed of what I did because my father, who's been dead for 10 years, what would he think of that? If you're a pure materialist, you would say, no, this is an absurd statement. He's dead, he cannot think. But to all of us, it's perfectly natural. So the idea is that humans are very good at interacting with agents that are not around. Marjorie Taylor here at Oregon does lots of research on children and their imaginary friends, and she shows that children with their imaginary friends are interacting with a real person in the sense that it's a person that's complex, that they have a rich interaction with. It's not just a little fantasy. So we're good at that. And if you have a doctrine that says that, well,
this one, I think this when I first encountered this idea, it really did kind of surprise me, but it makes so much sense. But we're really good at having relationships with people who don't exist. And you say that, it's like, what? And then you just mention novels, and it's like, oh, wow, yeah. Movies, yeah, we're really good at having relationships with people who don't really exist. So it's, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, what leads to that. There is an answer to that question, but just that basic point is like, yeah, we're really good at that. Comes up over and over again in culture.
Imaginary, well, those non-physical agents are around and they matter and they're interested in what's happening to you. They have a stake in your existence. That's the kind of idea that we find appealing, intuitively appealing, and which
and just, you know, think about that in terms of definition, right? The definition is already including, so there's something about you as a human being that's important enough that these spirits are paying attention. So it's, you know, the definition can be pretty rich even when the worldview seems a little sparse. As he's pointing out, some of those worldviews can be pretty sparse. But when you start toying at, well, what are the implications of these various ideas? You actually can get to something that's really pretty rich in terms of what it's doing and with defining what human beings are.
Explains things in our environment at a low cost because we already do that anyway, all the time. That's one. Let me take another example. We have lots of ideas of contagion, contamination, and purification in our everyday life. You know, in all societies in the world, people have ideas about contagion, about dirty stuff, about how to wash themselves and stuff like that, cleanse their bodies, etc. Now, religions tell you, well, there's that in a sort of invisible realm as well. You have, you know, religious blasphemy makes you impure. You have to purify yourself. You have to go through rituals to be cleansed of your sins. All these things speak to a little corner of our mind. I could go on, but the idea is that for many aspects of religion, they happen to be optimal for certain systems that we had anyway. And therefore, they're what we like to call good to think for human minds. They're low cost, as it were, there's not much effort. in entertaining them, but also their high, we call that high inferential potential. That is just jargon for saying once you have them, you can generate lots of explanations for things around you, or at least lots of comments on things around you. So given those features, it would be surprising if human minds didn't actually catch these ideas and because they're catchy for us and retain them. So in a way, we're not saying there's an instinct for religion in human minds. We're saying, no, there's just lots of dispositions for things that sound like religion, and nothing sounds like religion better than religion. So that's where we are at the moment.
That was a great answer to the complexity of
Yeah.
why religious
We have
beliefs appeal to us. Is it also simplistic to ask from the neurobiological point of view whether there's a particular piece of the brain that gets involved in this?
Yes, it's very likely that a good many neural systems are involved in those things, simply because gods and spirits are persons. We have lots of systems that are there to interpret what persons are like and what our interaction is like with them. Gods and spirits are sometimes terrifying, and we have brain systems to handle fear of potential danger. Gods and spirits are also for us against the other guys, and we have brain systems to manage coalitions and conflict with others. So yes, the God bit of the brain is pretty much the brain. So I don't think we'll find the little lobe or bit of gyrus where it's located. It has to be everywhere. Yeah.
It's a great phrase. The God bit of the brain is the brain. Well, let me shift the topic just a little bit. You have another very catchy quotation, which is that atheism will always be a harder sell than religion. Could you explain that one?
Yes, it may seem a bit special, and you know, I was brought up in a culture where no one is religious, and where no one educated in particular is religious. It's completely sort of exotic. So of course, for me, it would seem that being a-religious, which doesn't mean really what atheism is like. I mean, people think of people against religion, but it's just a sort of indifference to religion. In most of Western Europe, for many, decades or maybe centuries now, it's been the sort of default mode. People are not terribly interested. But I'm saying that on the whole, if you look at the history of human societies, you have to realize that this kind of indifference to gods, spirits, and ancestors is pretty rare. And also that it only appears in places where there is a conflict against religion. For example, the most atheistic places in the world are places where there's been a lot of conflict with established churches. So where the church is seen as a sort of social oppression mechanism. So if you remove all these things, you realize that on the whole,
and also think about all the religious wars in Europe. So he has that in mind too. So Europeans have just sort of, religion is just too much hassle.
What's not terribly easy to sell about atheism is a set of propositions like some terrible misfortune happened to you. It might have happened to someone else, but it happened to you. And the reason for that is, well, there is no reason. That's it. Or some people get, all the benefits from social life. Some people don't. There are social reasons for that, but there's nothing else than social reasons for that. There's no meaning there. There's no purpose. Or if you say nature is around the way it is, but there's absolutely no purposive, agent behind it. These are propositions that take more effort to entertain simply because they remove something that is very natural for us, which is to say, if there is some big effect, there must be some big cause. And also, if there's a big effect in nature or in the world, the best cause would be an agent who wanted that effect to be around. I do some developmental studies with young children, and I know that, actually that's a good tip for parents of young children who are always bothering them with questions like why, So Cinderella went back to the castle. Why? Because she wanted to see the prince. Why? Because she wanted to get married. Why? And they go on. Usually you can stop that by just saying that's because she wanted it to be that way. And in the same way, why do we have blue eyes? Because we're born that way. Why we're born that way? Children can go on forever like that. You can stop that by putting an agent in the story at some point. If you say God wanted us to be like that, they say, okay, that's end of the story. And I think it's true for adults too. I mean, the idea that there's more agents or agency in the world than it seems is a very powerful one. If you are an atheist or if you're a materialist, you say, well, there's less agency in the world than there seems. Even societies are not really like agents. They're bundles of people and there's no real agent there. There's just millions of agents together. It's a complex system. It's not an agent. I think people don't find that worldview terribly appealing because it doesn't explain much. And it's pretty difficult to think about. Try to think of what's happening in the US without thinking of pseudo agents, like the government wants to do this. The Senate will remember that, all these, which are literally absurd because Senate doesn't have a brain or, we want to have those concepts. We need them. So if you're an atheist, you're basically saying to people, well, no, there's no such thing. Try to think without those things. I think that's a very hard sell. Yeah.
It's useful to hear that as a product in some ways of our contemporary society. I think we are going to have to close there. I'm sorry to.
So yeah, even when we know it's just sort of an analogy we're using, we'd use it all the time. Talk about what the government wants or what the Senate wants, or it's curious that shorthand is so available to us. And it's clearly reflecting a way of looking at the world in which those things are actual real, not just analogies. Let's see here. So,
Richard, just going with the child thing, my daughter, when she was 4 or 5, asked who the first person in the world was. And even though I did not believe, I said, well, some people think God was the first person in the world. And she went away. She came back like 2 minutes later and said, no, his mother and father were the first person.
Oh, see? It was enough about the world to know your story wasn't fitting the worldview. That's interesting. Huh.
Yeah, she thought about it.
Okay. So after that, I have a guy who has collaborated with Boyer named Justin Barrett. And Barrett does more detailed neuroscience stuff. And is especially focused on this agent issue. Let's see if I'm going to make that work. Oh, here we go. Okay.
To discern whether God, Justin, in trying to discern whether God exists, you have to look at religion because that's the expression supposedly of how God is dealing in the world of human beings. But it is quite evident, especially in recent times, that there are very naturalistic expressions of how religion can come about without any need of God. In fact, you've been a pioneer in the cognitive science of understanding religion. So let me understand how religion can come about, assuming there was no God. Wouldn't it be the case that we would expect religion to occur anyway?
Yeah, Barrett's actually best known for a book called Religion Explained. So
we certainly have accounts of how religions might come about without making any direct appeal to the existence of gods. And there are various versions of these accounts, but one might go as follows. Because of the way that human minds naturally work, from early childhood, the way we develop makes us really interested in and excited about explaining the world around us in terms of minded beings, in terms of someone's around us who are acting, who have beliefs and desires and act to bring about their desires, to satisfy those. That would have been a normal part of our social interactions from way back in our evolutionary history. Certainly it's the case from the word go when babies come out of the womb. They're looking for the people. There's evidence that babies, newborns, are selectively attending to face-like things and can even imitate facial expressions. People and other kinds of objects to act on their own seem to be particularly important to babies. And all of us, right? I mean, we're social beings. Well, and if that's right, sure looks like it is, we can extend that too. We can extend that to thinking about the intentions behind the natural world. The beings out there who might account for perceived order and purpose that other research has shown that babies have. And because that order and purpose out there in the natural world, the rhythms of life cycles, the remarkable beauty that we see, seems to cry out for an explanation. And regular mechanistic explanations don't do the job. A someone seems to be the right
So I hear you talking
explanation.
about two separate ideas that come together. One is the search for agents,
Yeah.
willed beings of any kind. And the other is a search for purpose, for end results, teleology, as we say, looking for why things happen with a reason. And these are two separate items that you say you see both in babies, a desire to see agents and a desire to see purpose. So if you bring them together, that's a very powerful combination.
That's right. And we also see that children 3 years old, say, also have a tendency to attribute super properties to minded beings, to agents, including their mother. That they have sort of super knowledge, super perception.
My daughter, when she was about 3 or 4 years old, drew a picture of her mother with one eye. And she said she only needed one eye to see everything I was doing.
Mothers are great at pulling off this sort of omniscience kind of act. Actually, my children are teenagers now, and they're still sure that mom knows everything that they do. They're probably right. But yeah, that disposition to attribute super knowledge and super power and maybe even immortality seems to be there from very early on, and can be a little hard to shake sometimes. Well, that makes it very easy to adopt belief in super knowing and super perceiving gods as well. So if you put together all of these little factors, maybe there's a lot of natural encouragement to at least entertain the idea of gods. And then some of my evolutionary studies friends will come along and say, yeah, and once you've got gods in your community, they're good at solving cooperation problems. They maybe make it harder for people to cheat on each other because they're afraid that the gods will catch them even if the people don't and might punish them. And maybe that makes us more cooperative. And maybe then those cooperative communities are more successful than those that don't believe in God.
So the gods came about through these mechanisms of an individual, even at very young ages, looking for agents, looking for a purpose, all knowing. And then when they emerge, they get reinforced by the community.
It sure looks like that could be the way it goes. That's right.
So that looks like a very nice, complete system that religion can develop without any reference to whether there's a God.
That's right. In this kind of explanation, we haven't put any cards on the table of whether or not the gods are real. So it looks like we've got this full explanation. Now I'm hedging a little bit here. I say it looks like, because the naturalistic assumptions that we started with, of course, precluded bringing the gods in anyway.
Right.
So occasionally I do hear this kind of response. Well, maybe that part of the mind that's sort of busy finding agents out there, intentional beings, minds, is so permissive because there really are spirits. And if it wasn't good at detecting them, it would be trouble. I've heard this kind of explanation. Maybe, or here's another version, maybe not quite as exotic. Maybe it's the case that all of our cognitive capacities have been sort of divinely appointed. Yeah, they've evolved, but because God selected this world and this evolutionary process to bring about beings like us, so that they would have a receptivity to the divine. Just because you guys didn't bring God in doesn't mean God wasn't part of the background factors that you accidentally have brought in, even though you weren't aware of it. Sort of they're tacitly in the background. It's part of the furniture or the stage for this kind of explanation.
And they would go further than that. They would say, if there's a God, then that would be the only way that God would create beings that would have a relationship with him. I mean, so it becomes a self-consistent system.
That's right. That's right.
And I don't think there's anything that science can do to adjudicate between the two, but it can say that religion can be fully explained without need to refer to the reality of that God behind it.
Well, fully explained. I don't know if science
maybe a
ever
loaded
fully
term.
explains anything,
Yeah.
but within a certain kind of space, it can do a darn good job at least. And I'll tell you, that's one of the fun things about working in this area is people can come to this, whether they're religious or they're not religious, and we can do a whole lot of good work on the science and work together and have great agreement on that.
Do the religious people get mad at you though? I'm sure some.
I
do.
seem to manage to make everybody a little bit mad at me.
Well, what do your religious friends say that show that they're not happy with what you've done?
Well, of course, some religious people are uncomfortable with bringing evolution in at all.
Okay.
Even those that might be comfortable with evolution might feel a little bit uncomfortable, at least, with the idea that you're using evolution to explain why people have tendencies to believe in God. That sure seems like there's something sinister going on there.
But that's not going to deter you.
No. I don't see an inconsistency between full-bodied religious beliefs and doing this kind of science. At least certain religious beliefs that are happy with the way that science works, and I'm happy with it. And besides, whenever you are pushing the bounds in any area, well, yeah, upset people on both sides. And for every person who grouses at me a little bit, religious person, I have probably 3 or 4 others who say, oh yeah, well, actually, you say children have a natural receptivity to God. Well, that's what the prophet taught as well. Or, well, that's what St. Paul taught. Or that's what we Hindus have said anyway. So.
To comprehend the world, science is essential.
It's remarkable how time and
There we go. Okay. So there's one kind of detail that I talk about in the book that's worth taking a moment to mention to you all. And it's the term that Barrett came up with that he calls hyperagency detector. And so the idea there is that he's trying to look at, well, what is it about the brain that is doing this, looking for agents in the world? What is that? Where would that come from? And what he's come up with is an evolutionary story that helps us understand prey and predator relations. So the thinking is that when mammals first evolved in the age of the dinosaurs, mammals were little shrews, kind of little mouse-like things, right? And one of the defining features of little rodents is that they're jittery. And you might ask why, and what he's going to explain is it's evolutionarily useful. So if the little shrew's brain is out, running around monitoring the world, and it hears a scratchy sound somewhere off in the distance, the shrew, and in fact, any kind of mammalian prey animal will immediately run away. And that kind of immediate response is a little bit risky from an evolutionary point of view, because you're using a lot of energy to do that. But if you're right, that in the reaction that the noise was made by something that was an agent, and you're really tiny, most agents in the world are things that want to eat little tiny things. And so running away got you out of danger, and so you survive to reproduce those genes. So so you can see sort of in the history of early mammals that this a tendency to be jittery about especially noises gets built in. And then he points out, well, you go a bit farther in that evolutionary development, and you get predators. And the fox has the same systems in place, but as a predator now, when it hears the scratchy sound, it orients towards the scratchy sound and will run at it. And you have the same kind of evolutionary risk, in a sense, that if you run at and try to catch every noise you hear, you're wasting a lot of energy a lot of the time. But if enough of the time there actually was something there to catch, then you get dinner. You survive, you pass on those genes. And so as mammals have developed, we've inherited these patterns from the past in which our brain is built, has these built-in assumptions that any kind of noise, especially, but it can work with visual stimuli too, but it's especially strong with auditory stimulation, that anytime we hear something we don't know, can't understand, immediately our first assumption is someone did that. And that one can be a spirit as well as a person. And so think about walking through the forest at night is a really kind of spooky experience, even if you're in a forest that you're familiar with, because now you can't see all those things making noises. And so you have this experience of being somewhere and there are lots of noises, but you don't know what's making them or why. And your brain wants to assume that some of them might be wanting to eat you. And so we just naturally respond to the world that way. And in the book, I point out, I suspect this is why auditory hallucinations are so debilitating for schizophrenics. Is your brain cannot but help. There's an agent. So it's so difficult to get someone to recognize, no, those voices, they're not actually someone, they're just inside. But you can't assume that. You have to assume they came from somewhere else. It's why children think there are monsters under their beds. And so it's really, really deep in that psychology, this hyper agency detector. So that's both Barrett and Boyer have that in mind when they talk about agents. That's what they're referring. That's what they're referencing is the neuroscience of the hyper agency detector, and why we're prone to make all of those assumptions. And then they just get worked out in different cultural ways, take lots of different forms. Okay, now I want to keep coming back to, because I think the word existentialism trips people up a little bit. Although we are going to talk, hopefully I'll have a little time to talk about Camus and what philosophical existentialism is. But all of these things are actually existential in a kind of deep human sense, in that they're those assumptions that the brain is making have to be expressed in a worldview somewhere, so that the worldview is going to help you navigate, well, what do I do with these kind of agents? And if you're an animist, you're going to be worried about making peace with a lot of them. But if you're a monotheist, you're going to have a different sense of what agents are doing and or how many agents there are. So the worldview is playing a really important role in mediating between sort of spontaneous brain processes and spontaneous reactions, and then what they mean. And again, this is all happening below conscious awareness. So think about what we learned from Ramachandran, that the information comes in, it goes to the amygdala to see what's my emotional reaction to this information coming in, goes then to the hippocampus to get compared with memory. Do I remember this before, and do I remember what my emotional reaction was to it before? And then it goes back through the amygdala again to decide, do I need a different emotional reaction based on the memory tied with the experience? And then it comes to your conscious awareness. So you've gone through 2 cycles of giving an emotional coloring to the experience, and then 1 cycle of giving a memory interpretation to the experience before you're even aware you had an experience. And we have a sense that that our brains can really work this fast. Just think about if you're driving and your car goes into a skid, or there's an accident all of a sudden, and it can seem like time slows down. That's because your brain has moved so fast that it's pumped your body full of adrenaline in a split second, and the adrenaline has the functional ability to make your cognitive processes speed up, which is why it seems like time slows down. But that adrenaline won't help your muscles move faster. You might actually have more strength, but you're not going to move faster, so you get frustrated that your body is still moving slow, even though your brain is moving faster. So that's why it seems like time is slowed down, but that time even includes your own body. And that's how fast your brain is moving, that all of that can happen and then pump you full of adrenaline. And then you're aware that something's going on that you need to pay attention to. And that's all below your conscious awareness. So these are really powerful circuits in the brain that are behind all of this. And so that's why they drive such sort of passionate responses in the world from people. Okay. How is that with people? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is that mechanism of, going back and forth between the hippocampus and the amygdala and then to the frontal lobe, is that pretty much established science, or is this a new field or something? No, it's established.
Yeah, Ramachandran's work did that 15 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, at least. Maybe 20. Yeah. No, that's established. Janet?
So, just going back to a little bit of evil problem here. So, we have the worldview, we have this agency relationship, we have that worldview, and then something bad happens. And I think you've separately said that that's the main reason people give up a religious membership.
In the modern world, yeah.
So, but if our agency was using it, if our need for agency was looking for both explanations of good and evil, then why would people depart? Is it that the institution has just used the agent for good?
Mm-hmm.
And
well, in a sense,
didn't deal with that negative, didn't deal with the bad, and then people feel abandoned.
To some degree, right. So it's a problem that's inherent to the logic of monotheism. So if you have any kind of polytheism, the idea that some of those gods or spirits are malicious and some are benevolent is sort of natural, since the world is at times benevolent to us and malicious to us. So when you get to monotheism, that's actually when you get a problem, because logic of that has said, well, but there's only one spirit who's really in charge, and that spirit's good. So whence is the bad coming?
Yeah, or unless the spirit's not good.
Well, so that could be the answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, there's one spirit, but is actually not particularly
a mixed blessing. Okay. So, because it just seems like the institution took it to the wrong place. So, okay.
Well, it's following a certain logic that's with this monotheistic claim. And
Yeah.
what we can see in the history, people resist it a lot. You know, that there's constant recourse to other sorts of spirits. People still, Christians want to attribute this sort of super agency to Satan. And when Christianity was sort of first growing in the first few centuries, there's this thing called Manichaeism that becomes very popular.
Yeah.
You know, the Christian God is a different God than the Hebrew Bible God. You know, so people, have a kind of built-in intuition that wants to see those explanations deployed. And if you take it away, now the problem of evil gets real.
Okay.
Alrighty. Oh geez, we're running low on time. I actually need to run a little bit early, but I did want to introduce you to John Dewey. So Dewey was a very important American philosopher, born 1870, maybe somewhere around that. But early 20th century was when he's an adult and important, and going into like the 20s and 30s. It comes out of a school of thought that's called American pragmatism. So it's a kind of a special American approach to doing philosophy that situates itself between the traditions that come out of English philosophy or Anglo-American philosophy, which we call analytic and are very interested in language and logic, and then the philosophies that come out of the continent, which are more interested in things like history and what is human being. So lots more, more interest in existentialism or psychoanalysis, those kinds of things. And so American pragmatism is kind of operating in between it. And Dewey's very significant in this story because one of the things that he was involved with was advocating for religion to abandon theism. And he's most famous for his work on education. He's so very, very famous for things he did with that. And then the religion piece is where he's really more, obviously more controversial. But I really wanted to sort of just introduce you to him real quick because he comes up at the end of the chapter. And I have this one is just him talking a little bit about education. You can see the date from 1929, but I thought it'd be interesting just to show you a little bit of what he looks like.
I am not here to knock going to college. If a young person has the opportunity to go and has the
You're not sharing the screen.
Oh, nuts. Silly me. There we go.
To take advantage of it, it's a good thing. But going to college is not the same as getting an education, though the two are often confused. A boy or a girl can go to college and get a degree, not much else. On the other hand, a boy or a girl in a shop, factory, or store can get an education without a degree if they make up their mind to it. They have to want to learn.
So, anyway, humanistic kind of stuff. This is the kind of thing he was definitely very public about advocating. Was formal education, yes, but education generally. People need to have a much more broader sense of education and valuing learning. Anyway, that's not the important bit. I just thought it was fun just to see him. So this is me, other people talking about him.
To start with, he is drawing from a conception of a Christianity that's moving beyond the particulars of doctrine, right? Particular doctrinal claims, and more to the level of sort of statements of truth. Something like the resurrection as a non-historical reality, but that really what it ultimately is, the resurrection in its fullness, is the principle that all of life shall be redeemed and resurrected, right? So that there's a rationalism that the resurrection in all of its supernatural weirdness has to be dismissed, and what's left behind is philosophy adjudicates what's really rational about the resurrection. And this comes to be linked then also to what the church is, right? So the church is not the gathering to start with.
Why did that leap so far?
To start with, he is drawing from a conception of a Christianity that's moving beyond the particulars of doctrine, right? Particular doctrinal claims, and more to the level of sort of statements of truth. Something like the resurrection as a non-historical reality, but that really what it.
Okay, I'm gonna do that. Okay, I think I must have mixed up my notes, and there was a different video I had in mind. It started differently, so I messed something up. Anyway, as I said earlier, I need to head out just a little early anyway, and we're here at about 1:15. So I think I'm going to try and wrap things up. But anyway, so big idea from this chapter is that human brains are going to need definition, and paired with that have these different built-in capacities to find elements of that definition in the sense of pieces that could become a worldview naturally. And it has a lot to do with this assumption about agents, and there being more agents in the world than are visible to us at the present. So next chapter is going to be about social, how we're social beings, and how religion is fitting in with helping us to be social beings. So any questions at this point?
Yeah, if I can, this Bill Fort, sorry to be late, but had a conflict. One of the things that I encountered this year, we went and took a grandchild up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Dalhousie University I was interested to find, was founded on the basis of a dispensation in a way from the king, I guess, to not have, because at that time Canada wasn't, in sometime in the 1800s, to be non-religious as a school. So it's not based on religion. So it's and I thought that was quite interesting. I don't know what the history to that is in the United States, but there are schools, and I don't know very much about it, this whole issue of education and whether or not it's based in religion in that sense. But I also wondered, and this could be in the social area, when we get to co-education and we have the merging of females into male education, and then the reverse, merging of the schools changing so that it's both men and women, and how that might or might not relate to religion in a way.
I think it actually fits here in that, because that's going to be part of that definition. So so being male or female then are going to fit into that worldview. And so that'll be part of that. How are we defining what people are? And so, so the religion is definitely a big part of sorting that out. Or should men and women be treated differently? Should they be treated the same? And yeah, those are going to be worldview issues. Okay, well, I'll let you go there. Yeah, I'm gonna be a little delayed getting at the recording, so it might take me a day or two, but I'll get that out and send you all a link to it, in case you want to review it. And then I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about being social. Joanna, yeah. Nope. Okay. It's not. All right. See you later.